Risk. It's something we're all familiar with. The possibility that something bad will happen. Not a great feeling. It's something that features prominently in economics. The risk that workers might lose their jobs, business owners miscalculate demand, and investors lose money. There's a lot of it around right now. In fact, there's a whole swathe of countries exposed to a potent cocktail of risk. From high debt and soaring borrowing costs, to younger generations of voters fed up with being told to make do on less. So this week on Reuters Econ World, we thought we'd dive into those risks and the countries most affected by them. It's what we do here on Reuters Econ World. Every week, we pick a phrase or buzzword and go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. This week, risk. I'm your host, Carmel Crimmins, in Dublin. Violent clashes in Kenya. Political opponents fight in Bolivia after a failed coup. Violent reminders of the dangers posed by faltering economies and punishing austerity measures. Around the world, middle-income countries are bearing the brunt of a growing debt burden. Why are they so exposed? And what are the risks for them and their lenders? I'm joined by Karin Strohecker, our chief correspondent for emerging markets, to talk about all of this. Karin, welcome.
Hi, Carmel. How are you?
I'm well, Karin. Can you explain to our listeners, what do emerging markets mean?
So at the very base level, emerging markets are a country that's on a journey from a low-income, often pre-industrial economy towards a more modern industrial economy and more rich economy with a higher standard of living and where people are more wealthy generally. And as they go on this journey, they do also engage more with global financial markets, which is where we as Reuters journalists often come in.
So we're talking about risk today. And risk is a big factor for investors when they think about putting their money into emerging markets, right?
Yes, for sure. Basically, if you are an investor, you want to put money to work somewhere, you need to be compensated for your risk.
Right.
The higher the risk, the higher you expect the return to be, but also the risk of actually losing your investment.
Got it. So investors in emerging markets are constantly sort of surveying the horizon to see what risks might be out there. And therefore, you too, right, as someone who covers this ecosystem, you're constantly scanning to see what the risks are, what's out there.
Yes, absolutely. And there's, of course, a multitude of risks. Like we've seen some huge shocks in recent years, right? We have seen like the COVID crisis and shutting down economies and the fallout that had, even if you didn't have maybe COVID in your country or were more marginally affected, you were still part of the global ecosystems.
Mm-hmm.
So you still get hit. Or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which massively pushed up food prices and energy prices across both actually emerging and developed markets. And then, of course, we have all these individual, or what we call idiosyncratic stories in those countries. And this year has been super heavy on that front because we had all these elections going on.
Right.
And of course, the elections are very much a local or domestic story, but they can have huge ramifications.
Within the emerging markets or community, you have low-income and middle-income countries. And I often think that the less wealthy the country, perhaps the more risk there is. But in recent weeks, it's been the middle-income countries that have been grabbing the headlines with a lot of unrest. Why is that?
Yeah, for sure. So we often, when we talk about income of countries, we look at how the World Bank classifies these countries. And the World Bank generally goes by low income or then all the way to high income, very high income. And there's a big middle chunk that we're looking at as well. And when we had all these recent shocks, like when we had COVID shutdowns, when we had the Russia-Ukraine crisis, what happened is that those were such huge shocks that the very poorest countries at the bottom end of the spectrum, they got debt relief pretty quickly. And it was very clear that those countries often don't have the buffers to survive that in an economic sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the very rich countries had buffers to be able to provide their population with support, employment schemes or employment replacement money, or keep a lid on energy prices. But there's a huge chunk in the middle that didn't really have the benefits of debt relief, but also might not have had the buffers available to help and support their population.
So kind of like the squeeze middle, but in an economic sense.
Yes, exactly. And so we've been through 4 years where a lot of populations, a lot of people around the world have suffered from a cost of living crisis. And now the social discontent at how politicians have handled this has risen in a lot of countries to a level we have not seen before.
And they also have particular metrics when we look at their finances. These middle income countries are particularly exposed to higher interest rate costs, higher prices, right?
Yes, exactly. And as we have seen inflation creep up since we had those crises, the global central banks have ramped up interest rates. And what that meant is that for countries, for example, Kenya, which is a lower middle income country, who has to borrow on international financial markets to roll over its government finances, all of a sudden they had to pay a much, much, much higher interest rate. And if those countries don't have the financial buffers, then markets get nervous and investors want higher returns because they see there's a higher risk in the country. And so it becomes a little bit of a spiral to the detriment of the country.
Kenya is a real-world example of this risk in action. President William Ruto pulled back from introducing sweeping tax hikes in late June after widespread and violent protests. Dozens of people were killed. Ruto has sacked his cabinet to address public anger over its performance.
Recent events that necessitated the withdrawal of the finance bill, which will require a review and reorganization of our budget and fiscal management, have brought us to an inflection point.
The finance bill was part of policy reforms agreed with the International Monetary Fund to ensure access to funding. But a hard-pressed population is reeling from rising living costs. People like Muthoni Wanjiku in Nairobi, describing how hard it is day to day and why there's widespread frustration.
We can't even afford diapers for the kids anymore. There are no vaccines in the hospitals for the children. We need this government to do something, and we can't just be praying all our problems away.
So Karin, for Kenya, for President Ruto, he does need to cut the deficit, right? He does need to do something about the hole in the government budget.
Yes, he really, really does. And so he had this grand plan, of course, to raise taxes, but we have seen those deadly protests. So now he has to come up with a different plan. There's really only two levers you can pull. You can either raise more money, increase your revenue, or you can cut your spending, which often, as a government, is on the population. So neither of those will be easy choices, not for Ruto, not for anybody, really.
It's not just Kenya, right? There's been unrest in other countries.
Yes, there has been unrest in a number of other countries. We had, for example, that sort of what's been labeled an attempted coup in Bolivia. That came at the end of a lot of discontent about lackluster economic growth in a country that really needs growth. We have seen a huge amount of protests in Argentina, which is at the moment undergoing really, really quite dramatic changes and reforms, which, of course, in the first instance, are painful for the population and make them poorer, hurt them. And so the IMF actually spoke to us journalists recently, and they were saying very much that there's a few countries that are in the same position as Kenya. This is not an isolated case. There is a lot of discontent, and there is a very fine balance that will have to be tread by policymakers on shoring up their finances, making sure they're on a sustainable path, but also making sure they don't just spend money without having it.
What is the IMF's role in all of this?
The International Monetary Fund is really the lender of last resort for many of these countries. If they can't get money from anywhere else, they go to the IMF and ask for a loan. But that loan program, that is usually like 3 or 4 years, has to be agreed with strings attached. The IMF will demand reforms, and what they want to see is to bring debt back to a sustainable path. And so exactly how the country gets there, it's also a little bit down to the country. They can agree with the IMF what measures they want to take to get back on that path. But the IMF, the way IMF loans are structured, they pay out in tranches every 3 months or maybe 6 months. And only if you clear a reform hurdle and deliver on your side will you see the next tranche of money. It's not just one big whack of money. You have to show that you're making reform and progress throughout your program.
The IMF have traditionally got a lot of criticism for imposing, what have been perceived as harsh measures on countries. Are they still getting a lot of criticism this time round?
So, yes, is the short answer. The question is possibly, there is an element, of course, is that criticism justified or isn't it? And that is a more nuanced question now. We have seen in the 90s and in previous decades, we have seen the IMF demand really quite harsh austerity for those countries who have requested and got an IMF program. I think the demands, I would say, are not that stringent anymore. They're not that harsh anymore, really. So, however, when you looked at the placards that were waved by protesters in Kenya, they did mention the IMF for sure. And there's a question, yes, the IMF is demanding these reforms. Can you foresee that a government might look in its own backyard and said, like, well, maybe it was our fault, not the IMF's fault? That's possibly not something politicians want to do. And that's very understandable. So at times, that criticism in the past has been justified with the IMF, though there is also an element of the IMF sometimes becoming, maybe if you want to call it, a scapegoat for quite painful reforms that have to be done.
If we take a step back with these middle-income countries, would it be fair to say that they borrowed a lot pre-COVID? Like, how have they ended up with these big debt burdens?
So that's very interesting because as a country, as a government, as an economy, you need to invest. And you're trying to find money from all parts of the global financial system, right? You will try and find money if you're a poorer economy, maybe from the IMF, and you will get some World Bank loans. Mm-hmm. But you're also trying to go to global capital markets. You're basically trying to get as much money as possible to invest in your infrastructure, to invest in your schooling system and your health system, to bring your country forward on that journey to becoming a developed market. But of course, we had super, super low interest rates for a very long time. And so it was quite tempting to borrow. But that equation changes very much when interest rates go up and you might have to roll over your loan.
So how much of their revenues, for instance, would be taken up with servicing the debt? Like how much of the money they earn has to actually go towards that?
So in the case of Ghana, this was quite high. Between 70 and 100% of government revenue actually went into servicing their debt at some point before their default.
Wow.
Which is a huge amount of money. But now they're out of this, hopefully on the other side. But basically, the United Nations warned that in 2023, we had a record of 54 developing countries. That's like around about 40% of total developing economies that had to allocate 10% or more of their government revenues to interest payments. And they also flagged that half of those countries were in Africa. That is where a lot of the poor countries are. And of course, if those 10% or more, and in some cases significantly more, that are being spent on debt service, that's money that can't be spent on schools or health or other basic development needs.
So Karin, what is the current state of play? Like, how worried is the international community?
Yeah, so there are really two sides to the coin at this point. In recent months and weeks, we had quite some good news. We've seen Zambia and Ghana and also Sri Lanka working through their debt restructuring and now being really in the final stage and coming out of it. And we had the Paris Club of rich creditor nations actually declaring, we think the tide is turning on that default wave of the very poorest country in the world. On the other side, We had a number of the multilaterals and risk agencies, specifically the World Bank, actually warning that there's a raft of middle-income countries, lower middle-income countries, which are by no way out of the woods yet after these years of shocks and crises. And they're really warning that the debt crunch that we've seen emerge in those very, very poor countries before, that could cause some ripple waves, and elsewhere we could see similar situations, and that would cause a huge problem for international lenders, for multilaterals, well, for the whole world, really.
That's it for this week. Next week, are you ready for it? We're taking a look at Swiftonomics. Is it really a thing? Until then, a big thank you to Karin Strohecker and everyone who covers markets and economics at Reuters. You can read all their great work on the Reuters app or Reuters.com. Jonah Green is the producer on this show. Sound design is by Josh Summer. Leela de Kretzer is our executive producer. Our podcast team includes Kim Vanell, Tara Oakes, Gail Issa, David Spencer, and Chris Woljasper. Remember, for all your daily news, check out our weekday show, Reuters World News. You can catch it on the Reuters app, Reuters.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.